let's talk about the Russians taking a big fat L on the Kerch Bridge. The bridge, so great, they just had to go back and do it again, the Ukrainians. They had to go back. They released the hit signal, last year, and now they had to release the remix. They didn't re-release the original. They had to adjust it a little bit. Let's listen to the bare bones news, and then let's talk about it.
Russian officials say a Ukrainian attack has killed 2 civilians on a bridge connecting Crimea and Russia. Moscow's anti-terrorist committee said the strike on the Kerch Bridge was carried out using waterborne drones. Video shared by local media appears to show a section of roadway split and sagging to one side. There were earlier reports of explosions heard in the area. The bridge is an important supply line for Russian forces. It's 19 kilometers long and provides the main link for road and rail traffic between Russia and the Crimean Peninsula. It was damaged in a powerful blast last year. And for more,
we don't need to listen to anything else. That's the bare bones facts. That's all really you need to know, because we've been here before. This is not a news story in the way that, like, oh my god, we've done something that's never been done before. This happened before. This happened last year. And now the Russians are saying that this right here was a red line. That's the statement that Vladimir Putin released. I don't know if we have something pulled up here, but Vladimir Putin vowed that this was a number one, that this was a terrorist attack, and we're going to talk about that claim first. We're going to talk about that claim in a second, not first. And that he's going to get revenge for this crossing of the red line. Let's read about it. Vladimir Putin has vowed to retaliate following a terrorist attack on the bridge linking Crimea to Russia. Moscow has blamed Ukraine for the incident, which left 2 people dead, but Kiev has not officially said it was responsible. This is actually not true. This has changed a little bit. Ukraine claims responsibility for new attack on Crimean Bridge, so that is no longer the case. The Kerch Bridge was opened in 2018 and enables road and rail travel between Russia and Crimea, Ukrainian territory annexed by Russia in 2014. Russia's transport ministry said the bridge's support were not damaged. Ministry said, by the way, don't just trust the Russian transport ministry at face value, because originally the Crimean Occupation Authority, after the bridge exploded and everybody in Crimea like wait, what was that sound? He just released a statement like nothing happened, nothing's going on. Then Moscow said you can release a statement, and then he released a statement. So he was just, bullshitting his people until Putin said that he no longer had to bullshit his people. The ministry said investigations were continuing, but unconfirmed reports said that the explosion was heard on early Monday. Russian authorities have accused Ukraine of attacking the Kerch Bridge with 2 unmanned surface vessels, drones that travel over water rather than through air. So last time, there was a lot of speculation as to why, or like what destroyed the bridge. There was talk it was possibly this van that was filled with explosives that blew up the bridge, which I think most of the evidence pointed towards. It could have been underwater drones. That was another possibility that was floated at the time, but then eventually kind of, just not really dismissed, but shown to be not a likely scenario from the multitude of the evidence. But now it looks like that was the case during this Kerch Bridge. So this is why I don't say it's the same hit single. This isn't Zelensky releasing the same single again. This is Zelensky releasing a remix of the original tune. And yet the BBC has not seen any visual evidence to confirm this. But a source in Ukraine security services told the BBC in Russia it was behind the attack and that water-based drones were used. In televised comments on Monday evening, the Russian president accused Ukraine of launching the senseless and cruel attack. The attack on the bridge has damaged the road it carries, but the railway line, and this is important, running parallel to it has not been damaged. This is really bad. So I don't know if we're going to have the terrorist statement here, but the first thing I want to say is, why is this important in the first place? Let's say you weren't tuning in for the last time the Kerch Bridge was attacked, and you don't know why it's important. Well, let's talk about that. Oh, 1 second. I need some lag. Wait for the lag to end. Okay, I think the lag's over. We can continue. Danabo, you're going to have to edit that out. Congratulations. That's your job. Okay, so for those of you who don't know why the Kerch Bridge is important, let's pull up the deep state map for a second, and I'll try to explain it. It's not very complicated. I don't think it'll be hard to explain. So the reason why the Kerch Bridge is important, and this is where the Kerch Bridge is because this is the only connection by land between Russia proper as in, okay, it's taking a second to load, but Russia proper and Crimea. And this makes it a very vital transportation line for Russian troops, for Russian equipment, say tanks, artillery guns, artillery shells, bullets, soldiers, transport trucks, armored personnel carriers, AFVs, like everything. Everything gets transported through here, and the equipment that is transported through here is used in Kherson, occupied Kherson, the parts of Kherson that are still occupied, and Zaporozhye. And considering that the Ukrainians are currently launching a counteroffensive in Zaporozhye, and they've, according to a recent report from the New York Times, have taken about 5 miles of territory, and they're continuing to push to try to take back more, which could see the Russians, if the Ukrainians are completely successful, cut in half with their land bridge destroyed. This is an extremely important location for the Russians. They don't want their forces to be split in two, and they don't want their land bridge to be destroyed, which is one of the few things the Russians have actually garnered from this war. And so this is extremely important for Russian defenses in Zaporozhye. Now, with these roads destroyed, we have people having to take an alternative route. Russians in Crimea are taking an alternative route. I don't know if you saw this, but miles upon miles upon miles of Russians leaving Crimea for Russia proper happening right now. A lot of Russians who have settled in Crimea after its illegal annexation are deciding, look, all bets are off right now. This is the second strike on the Kerch Bridge. After the first strike, the Russians were like, that won't happen again. It's now happened again. We're going to pack our stuff and we're going to go. And they're leaving, and they're using the land bridge here through this way, through these road lines, through Mariupol, all the way into Russia proper to get away from the violence in Crimea and the violence in occupied territory, all the occupied territories. So while this is good for undermining the Russian supply lines, I do want to note that the railway next to it was not damaged. So that means this bridge is still going to be used to supply the Russian army in occupied territory and has not been knocked completely out of commission. I will say one thing that is funny, though, and this is the one element in the story that I do think is very funny. When the first Kerch Bridge attack happened, there were statements from Russian government officials that they'll have it fixed by July of 2023. It's now July of 2023, and the bridge is being attacked again. So, first things first. Now that you've got all the bare bones facts, and this is really all the information you need for the bare bones stuff, what do I think of this? Well, obviously, it undermines the Russian war effort, which is good for the Ukrainians, but it was not completely decisive, as the rail line next to it, which was the main thing I was thinking about when it came to a future strike on this bridge, is still intact. And they're gonna have to not only take out the normal transportation lines like that cars and trucks use. If they really want to take out the Russian supply lines here, they're gonna have to take out the railway. As destructive as this is, and transporting troops and stuff like that, it's still not going to completely undermine it. So that's the first conclusion I want to take away from this. Second conclusion I want to take away from this. This will not be the last attack on the Kerch Bridge. It will not. It's happened once, it's happened again, and most likely it will happen a third time. Whether it will be a truck driven onto the road that explodes, whether it'll be another water drone, a drone launched on the water, whether next time it'll be like a normal drone, like a UAV, or maybe, and this is the big thing that people have been thinking about since these have been delivered to Ukraine, maybe it'll be a long-range missile like the Storm Shadow, which is in range of Crimea. For those of you who don't know, the Storm Shadow missile is a long-range missile that the British have provided Ukraine after the Ukrainians were asking for ATACMS long-range missiles to be sent. They were sent primarily because there are a lot of targets that the Russians have in occupied territory that the Ukrainians can't reach with the missiles that they currently have, that they had on before they had in hand, and with their artillery and the HIMARS and stuff like that. They didn't have enough range to hit ammo depots further back, to hit command centers further back, to hit supply lines further back, stuff that would be vital for any Ukrainian counteroffensive which they're currently engaged in. And so, since the United States would not give them ATACMS missiles, even though we are hearing reports now that maybe America will change minds on that. Maybe they actually will approve ATACMS missiles to be sent to Ukraine. The British stepped up and gave them the Storm Shadow missile. And that Storm Shadow missile, not only is it unbelievably accurate and unbelievably, like, very big, it's very destructive, but it also penetrates concrete very effectively. So it almost feels like it's like the perfect weapon to destroy a bridge like this. And so a lot of people have been speculating about whether or not the Ukrainians are going to use the Storm Shadow missile to attack this bridge. And of course, I can't give you an affirmative or not on if that's going to happen, but I do know for sure that the Ukrainians are going to attempt to attack the Kerch Bridge again. And considering that the Russians have now been unable to stop 2 attacks on the bridge, I think there's a very high likelihood of it succeeding. So, third point, and this is the point I do need to touch on because the Russians are saying this is a terrorist attack. I've seen other mouthpieces for the Russians say this is a terrorist attack online. I think a lot of people just either don't know what a terrorist attack is, or they are just, and this is what I think is the case with the Russian government and a lot of their mouthpieces in Western media, or I think they're purposefully obfuscating and they're purposefully just trying to paint this in the worst light possible in order to try to discourage types of attacks on their vital military infrastructure in the future. So a terrorist attack is not when a civilian dies in a military strike. That's not what terrorism is. If that was terrorism, then every single country during every single war is a terrorist state. Ukraine's a terrorist state. Russia's a terrorist state. America's a terrorist state. Everyone's a terrorist state. Palestine, Israel, Japan, South Africa, everyone's a terrorist state, okay? Because every nation state has engaged in war, and while they've engaged in war, they have killed civilians. Point blank, period. Either on purpose, which is, of course, horrible, terrible, and I think labeling that terrorism is a lot more accurate, even though some people will say that terrorism has to be a non-state actor, but I don't want to get into that discussion. I feel like that kind of avoids the core of why people are bringing this up. Or not on purpose, as in quote-unquote collateral damage, and sometimes it's not even just collateral damage, it's just like, oh, we don't care if we kill civilians, but that's still not terrorism. You could say that that's horrible. You can say that a lack of care for civilian casualties could even possibly be a war crime if you had enough evidence of that, but it's not terrorism. That's not what terrorism is. The point of terrorism is to kill civilians and maim civilians to intimidate them to, join your political cause. And the purpose of this explosion was to undermine one of the most important transportation lines for the Russians in this war. A vital, vein for the Russian war effort in Ukraine. In fact, probably one of the most, if not the most, important transportation line for the entire war, at least on the Russian side. So it is 100% a legitimate military target because the Russians are using it to transport military equipment. It is 100% not only a legitimate military target, but if any other country was in Ukraine's position, they would do the same thing, including the Russians. And lastly, I do want to say that the Russians have also struck multiple bridges inside Ukraine themselves and have engaged in actions that are a lot closer to the actual definition of terrorism, as in the careless disregard of civilian casualties or even the deliberate targeting of civilians, which I've documented personally on multiple occasions. I documented it in Kherson, for example, in my recent trip to Kherson, where they bombed and maimed rescue workers that were trying to save people from the flooding after the Novgorodka Dam exploded. So, no, this is not terrorism. Terrorism isn't when civilian dies in war. That would be a very simplistic and stupid definition of terrorism that removes all of the nuance as to why we call it terrorism. Was Bucha terrorism? See, that's something you can get a lot closer to the idea of terrorism. Reckless, going out and deliberately executing civilians. Yeah, that you're getting a lot closer to the idea of terrorism. But even then, some people will say it has to be a non-state actor. Either way, under no definition of terrorism that any military historian would give any credibility is civilian dies during war the definition of terrorism. That's just not what it is. Of course, I do want to say that The two people who died, it was a mother and a father, and their daughter was injured. That's a tragedy. I hope the daughter gets all the support they need. It's really sad that they're a victim of this war, and I do want to give that attention to it because I don't want to cynically use them to benefit the interests of the Russian state, as many people have, but I also don't want to disregard them and not talk about the civilians who died in the attack, because I want to be honest with you, and I believe that all civilian casualties should be talked about and should be, if at all possible, avoided. Anyway, I don't really have much more to say about this. Don't expect this to be the last strike on the Kerch Bridge. Expect probably more strikes like this in the future, possibly with a Storm Shadow missile. That's all I got to say about that. That's all I got to say about that. What do you guys got to say about that? You guys got any opinions about the Kerch Bridge explosion? I could give a fuck less about Russian civilian casualties at this point. I'm numb to their suffering. That's not a good thing, Casey. That's a really bad thing. That's a very bad thing. I understand where it comes from, but that's a mentality that we need to be very careful not to take, because the more people take on that mentality, the easier it is to just go commit war crimes. Because if less and less people really care, then like what stops somebody from a Ukrainian commander from being like, you know what, I got these cluster munitions. What if I just fire them into Belgorod? Fire them into the Belgorod city center. That's really bad. And obviously, I have no reason to believe that a Ukrainian commander would do that, but we should not make it normalized, that type of behavior. Also, not to mention, I do want to say, okay, this is an illegal bridge. Somebody just brought it up, Captain TBT. It was set up in occupation. It was set up to help the Russians more solidify their occupation of the Crimean Peninsula. So, also, this bridge going kaboom is an actively good thing